Happy to start.
All right, go for it.
Okay.
Recording's going. There you go.
Thanks, Nicole.
Engage.
Actually, Laura, hold on. I forgot. I'm supposed to do my intro here. So, Nicole Dubuque, Chief Operating Officer for the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and I am the co-chair of the Ag Recovery Task Force, which is what this meeting is. And we are going to kick it off with Laura Ginsburg today.
Thanks, Nicole. So I'm Laura Ginsburg. I work at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets as the Dairy Strategy and Innovation Manager. I wear a couple of different hats. One is that I focus on state-based dairy issues, so marketing, market development, business assistance, policy. And then I also lead the team who run the Northeast Dairy Business Innovation Center, which is an 11-state federally funded really grant-making engine for business development and modernization, and also research. So with that being said, I was asked to join today to talk about some of the topics around dairy, because that's where I focus pretty much all of my time. And just wanted to give the caveat that some of the things that I'll talk about are regionally focused, but of like real critical importance to Vermont. So Nicole, would it be helpful for me to just spend like a couple of minutes giving sort of the state of dairy in Vermont?
I think that would be helpful. This group primarily focuses on kind of like recovery and response. And so I think, yeah, just where is dairy at and where are there some gaps would be probably good level set.
Okay, great. Thanks. So dairy numbers, overall farm numbers, continue to decline in this state. There was a pretty good stabilization actually in 2025. It was the lowest number of farm losses that have happened in this state since I've been here, which is since the end of 2017. Milk prices were good, input prices were relatively low. The beef market is very strong, and so there's real opportunity for dairy farmers to make additional revenues selling bull calves, which a lot of dairy farms are now crossbreeding their lower producing cows to beef breeds to be able to sell a higher quality calf. Those prices are really like astronomical at this moment in time. And so farms are doing pretty good last year, even with tariffs, which hurt processors to a much greater degree. What happened at the end of last year is there were quite a few changes in market pricing for the way that milk is priced on the commodity side, particularly for butter, that drove milk prices down to a point that we hadn't really seen since 2014 or 2015. And there was a lot of very significant concern around milk pricing. And a number of farms, the first part of this year, have opted to stop milking cows because the beef prices are so high and replacing animals are really high. So it's, if you think about timing of going out of business, it's an almost ideal time because they can sell their assets for a higher value than they normally could to pay off any outstanding debts. So there's a lot of movement happening in the state's dairy sector. In 2023, when we had the major flooding, followed by the sort of more regionally focused floods in 24, followed by the drought in 25, those have had fairly substantial impacts on dairy volume production. So while the state's farm numbers are declining, milk production is staying relatively flat, and that's been the case for the past 10 years. We've produced roughly the same amount of milk, with slight variations from year to year, even though we have fewer farms. And that is due to farms getting larger themselves or genetic gains in animal production capabilities. So the dairy sector has been breeding for animals who are more efficient and can produce more milk, and we're starting to see those impacts. What was really interesting is to look at milk production numbers, and I get those quarterly, and then I look at them at the end of the year. And after 2023, 2024 had a very significant decline, about 500, I want to say 500 million pounds. I have to look at my chart again, but it was a very significant decline. And Abby, I think, did you send those slides to this group that I shared with you?
I think Nicole did,
Okay.
right? Did we? Oh, I did not share them with this group. Sorry, Laura. I think you
That's okay.
shared them directly with the New England Food System Planners Partnership, but no, I did not share them with this group, but I can.
That's okay. I was just gonna pull up that one slide just to visualize, which I can do while I'm talking.
Okay. I know Abby
So
shared a couple of slide decks with me, so maybe.
here we go. I've got it right here. So this is what we saw. Let me just put this into the view mode so you can see it a little better. This is the result of the flooding in 2023. So you can see here 2023, we're pretty normal. So these are in billions of pounds. So every line is 0.1 billion pounds or 100 million pounds. So you can see we were at 2.55 roughly, and we went down to like 2.09. That is from flooding. 2024 is more sort of minor flooding, took us back up to that roughly 2.5 billion pounds. What I'm really interested to see, and we'll start to see it, the quarterly reporting for milk production was just coming out for the first quarter of 26, is the impact of the drought last year. People were buying feed from as far away as Colorado, a lot of feed coming from Wisconsin, Michigan, and a lot of feed moving around the state that was quite a bit lower quality for those drought impacted farms. Vermont is in a very interesting position at this particular moment in time because of all of the development that's happening in New York. So New York has there are a number of dairy processing facilities there that are brand new or expanding. Hundreds of millions of dollars of processing expansion are happening in that state, and farms are meeting that demand by also expanding. When there is a natural disaster like flooding or drought that requires farms to buy feed, if New York is impacted, New York has the advantage because they're closer to those feed producing states in the Midwest, and they have scale that we do not have. So for a farm, actually one of the farms that's located near me, I live down in Orange County, they brought in a tractor trailer load of haylage from Wisconsin, and they blew it right into their silo to use for the winter. That cost them more for hauling fees than a larger farm would have paid in New York to get multiple tractor trailer loads of a similar feed. And so the cost differentials for our smaller farms who can't buy in bulk is one of the things that I'm concerned about for this year as we still continue to recover from flooding and then the drought. Thinking about what's happening in New York also just pressurizes where milk is moving across the region. So Vermont has the most farms in New England. A lot of our milk is processed here. A lot of our milk crosses state lines to be processed, and the vast majority of it leaves the state to be consumed. When we think about Vermont, and when I think about Vermont, it's more appropriate to think about it as a major player in a region of dairy active states. And we recently just published this economic impact study, which I'll put the link in the chat. There's a webinar and a study which has some really great graphics, graphical representation of what is happening in this region. This was just released a few weeks ago, and it looks at the 6 states of New England. What we know is that there's about 925 farms 133 dairy plants, $6.3 billion of direct output, 27,000 jobs, $2 billion of supported labor income, and almost $10 billion of total economic contribution. So dairy remains a very significant player, particularly in Vermont and Maine on the farm side. On the processing side, it's much more impactful in the southern New England states. And we as a state, Vermont as a state, is highly reliant on processing plants that are outside of our borders in order to make our farm economy work. And that is underscored very clearly in this report, and I think of great interest for people who are working in the dairy economy and dairy development space, is that a lot of the potential future opportunity may need to happen outside of our state's borders in order to keep our farm populations thriving and with markets for their milk. So this study really highlights those connections, and it highlights where processing plants are in relation to farms, in relation to consumers, in a way that hasn't really been done comprehensively at all for the region before. Since this has come out, I've had a number of other states reach out and ask me how we did this study, to give them the details, to send the RFP, because now they want to do a study on their own specific economic factors for either for the forestry economy or for specialty crops or aquaculture. So I think a great way to look at what's going on in dairy in Vermont and beyond. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that workforce, like across many other sectors, is a very critical conversation. There are facilities that are operating understaffed and have been that way for a few years because they cannot find enough people to fully run the plant's capacity. That has downstream impacts to dairy farm prices, because if milk goes to a plant and they can't receive it because they don't have enough staff to process it, it has to go somewhere else and it's sold at a discount. And then farmers don't realize full value for that milk. That's been happening for a number of years now for plants in Vermont and across the region where Vermont milk goes. With New York's development, what we will likely see is more milk moving into New York, into those highly efficient plants that are producing products that consumers really desire, and less milk going into some Vermont plants, which is going to impact, again, staffing and revenues in Vermont and plant capacity. So that's something that I'm really keeping an eye on, is just like, how is workforce creating opportunities or becoming a gap that there's some real concern around, both on the farm side and on the processing side. In some cases, it's easier to automate a farm to do work for you than it is a processing facility, but processing facilities themselves are looking at efficiencies and doing quite a bit of investment to answer the workforce conundrum that they've been in for a number of years. I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. That was a lot of information on a number of topics.
Super helpful though, great visuals. Does anybody have any questions for Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I might have I don't know, I'm newer here, so maybe this is a silly question, but if we do wind up with like a flood or some other drought disaster this year, like, is there a role for the state to play in competing with those larger New York purchasers, like a Vermont bulk buy type of thing, to kind of match the scale that we're seeing those New York producers?
That's a great question, Miles. I know that we had the feed directory that the agency hosted in order for people to see where there was feed available to buy. I could imagine that there could be some facilitation between, I think back to COVID, actually, when the state helped facilitate excess loads of milk moving from a processor from a buyer, one of the co-ops, to a processor in order to do dairy product donation so that that milk wasn't dumped. I could envision maybe a similar scenario in which we're helping to facilitate the conversations at the co-op, or maybe even like a producer association level, to buy feed at discounted volumes in order to better compete if people are looking for the same thing.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, if anyone has any additional questions that come up after maybe you look at the study or other questions that come your way, I will put Laura's email in the chat. So feel free to reach out to her directly on any of this stuff. Sorry, Laura, maybe I should have asked you first, but I think
No,
that
please. I'm
when it
always
comes to
happy
these
to
visuals-
answer questions. Yeah, or provide additional resources. I've got a lot of stats and data, and the Dairy Innovation Center has done quite a few different studies on workforce and economic impact and training center. So there's a lot of movement there that will impact and benefit Vermont.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna move on to drought.
Oh. Travis, you came off mute. Did you have a comment or a question that you'd wanted to ask?
Yeah, I was just wondering, but I'll reach out later. But Laura, just curious, why New York? Is it just tax advantaged, tax incentives to build processing centers in New York?
Yes, there's quite a few state-based incentives for dairy processing development. The state also has a dairy farm investment tax credit program that actually the Milk Commission, so the Vermont Milk Commission is a body that can provide some structure to what's happening in Vermont dairy and some recommendations for how the state can better invest. So that Milk Commission will be learning about investment tax credit programs at our next meeting on May 26th. It's open to the public if anybody wants to join. So we're hearing from New York and Massachusetts that just started their program. The New York program is 20% of the investment cost as a tax credit. And if you can't write it off on your taxes, then you get a check for the difference. And that has had a very substantial impact in their farm growth. We see applications coming in to the Innovation Center from New York farms who are doing $5 to $10 million expansion projects. They're doubling or tripling their herd sizes. So New York is the 5th largest milk producing state in the nation. So there is milk there. The number of plants that are expanding is kind of unusual, I would say, in a single state in a very short period of time. And I would say that that is due to state-based approaches to business development, either tax credits or cheap energy or labor support for wages, or regulatory barriers or requirements that are different for both farms and processing plants to operate. So there are a number of things. It's also just there's so much land available for these types of major expansions, and they have the infrastructure logistics figured out with interstates and transport.
Yeah, awesome. The reason I ask is, I live in the islands and we're over in New York, kind of that area, and it seems like every large dairy I drive by is expanding, and it just kind of all putting together. But was just curious about, the supply or the processing center. So, yeah, super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a substantial. The plant expansions in New York will require New York to produce more than twice the amount of milk they currently do to fully meet the new plant capacity. So it's a very significant movement and change of how milk happens in this region.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mhm.
And Laura, would you also share like about this New York State supported infrastructure investments for on-farm? Like they also have made
Mhm.
tens of millions of dollars invested there too.
Right. So the Dairy Innovation Center has a program that's focused on farm milk storage and handling. So bulk tanks, pipelines, chillers, things like that. We invested a few $1 million of our federal funds. New York really liked our program, and their governor and legislature put about $25 million towards a New York State dairy farm improvement project. The very first grant round was essentially a model of ours, so it's milk storage and handling. The next round that they'll be launching will be focusing more on dairy facilities as a whole. So parlors and robotic milking and things like that. And that is, their grants are larger than what we can offer. They have more money. And so it's really accelerating that development on the farm side in that state as well.
Awesome. Okay. Abby, you want to take it away with some drought numbers?
Yeah, it's sort of sobering intel from the dairy, Laura, on the dairy sector. Interesting information and yeah, worthy of some pause to think through how this group can be helpful or strategic in what to do for the industry. Okay, so yeah, but I'm happy to, so this is, I do have some slides that touch on the 2025 drought impacts on Vermont farms. So I just thought I would do a quick review of the data. Some of you have already seen some of this. This is not kind of new concepts, but if you want to see the full report, or we have a data dashboard of the visualization on our website, and that's at the website agriculture.vermont.gov/drought. So the agency knew that we would release a survey to capture the impacts on farms early in the summer, and we waited until October 17th to actually release the ag drought impact survey, and then we closed it 2 months later on December 15th in 2025. And at that point, we'd already heard from producers that they were having, a sense of loss, and they were worried about the end of the growing season. And we wanted to give them that full growing season for most operations, get through corn chopping and hay harvesting and other diversified crop harvests before we asked them to complete the survey. The audience of this survey was for any business that was raising animals or growing feed or crops that was in Vermont, for anyone that was beyond their family. So it wasn't intended to capture backyard gardeners nor the forestry sector. But it did capture businesses like the equine industry, even if they were not growing food, and also captures value added producers. So let's see here. As you all may recall, about a year ago, we had a really wet spring in 2025, and most farms had started to communicate and share the impacts of little to no rain in a quick turnaround and experience of drought conditions as early as July. And then by August of 2025, Vermont was in a severe drought condition. And 2025 was the first year since 2000 where we had experienced extreme drought conditions. When the survey closed, we'd received 198 business responses that claimed over 15.5 million in losses that impacted 78,000 acres. And we had responses from all 14 counties across 109 towns. So that gives you a scale of what the 2025 claims were. And this next one actually shows a comparison between the losses that were captured across 3 different years of natural disaster-based survey responses that the agency led in partnership with other partners, many of you on the call. So you can see, in 2023, we had the July event, July 10th event, where Vermont received, most of Vermont. Actually, I'll save that because I'm going to show you a slide that kind of demonstrates what the impact was across the state. But you can imagine the cumulative impact of businesses that may have experienced something in losses or infrastructure harm or crop failure as a result of 2 years of flood and then a drought. A majority of the 2025 droughts respondents identified, so 74% claimed that they had experienced losses from at least one other extreme weather event since May of 2023. Just about 50% of the 2025 drought respondents were impacted by at least 2 other severe events since 2023. So that's a significant amount of consecutive harm and crop losses or industry or business impact on significant number of farmers within Vermont. Mostly the losses and impacts were related to rain and or flood events. And so this is where the drought was sort of an unexpected kind of weather condition that we hadn't seen on Vermont's landscape in about 25 years. So then this is the slide where it sort of shows the extreme growing seasons in succession. So in 2023, the blocks above are survey responses that the agency received. The information below captures from the National Weather Service what the weather forecasts were. So in 2023, you can remember on over 24-hour period in July, most of Vermont received somewhere between 3 and 7 inches of rain. And then in 2024, on the exact same day, the northern counties in Vermont experienced somewhere between 2 and 5 inches of rain. And then on the far right, by mid-October, almost the entire state was in severe or extreme drought conditions due to lack of rain in Vermont. So again, this is not new news to probably anyone on this call, but I think important to sort of like demonstrate the cumulative impact. And again, many of you probably knew and heard that national drought data showed Vermont as one of the top 3 states with the highest drought index in the United States. And as early as November of last year, Vermont was the 3rd highest in the state. Third highest in the nation, behind Maine and New Hampshire, but also in worse drought conditions than Arizona and the state of Washington. Currently, just for the record, the U.S. Drought Monitor data has that 40% of Vermont land base is still in what's considered abnormally dry or moderate drought conditions, and that's kind of focused on the southern 4 counties, and that impacts about 6% of our state's population would be considered still in drought conditions. All right, so a little bit more data from the drought survey. The greatest impacts of reported losses in 2025 were in Addison, Washington, Orleans, and Orange counties. Not surprising, our primary agricultural areas of the state. Franklin County was the 5th impacted county, though, as I mentioned, we had reported losses in all 14 counties. The 2 graphs to the right show the represented distribution of impacted farms by sector. So again, quite well represented. About 1/4 of the respondents were from the dairy industry, 1/4 from produce and horticulture, another 1/4 from our livestock and diversified industry. We heard from 8 maple producers. Same with farm size. So majority of those that responded to the survey were small farms. So we had 156 small farm responses, 11 MFOs, and 10 LFO responses. So again, a bit of a disproportionate impact on small farms simply because Vermont has a larger number of small farms in our total kind of farm portfolio. The most detrimental impacts, again, most survey respondents, about 85%, demonstrated some reduction in crop yields or total crop failure, and that included Christmas trees, field corn, produce. About half of respondents experienced insufficient pasture forage in the end of the growing season, and 63% of survey respondents reported feed shortages going into winter. And again, that kind of touches on some of those feed purchases that Laura mentioned. 30% of respondents hauled water for the first time ever. So again, whether that was for livestock watering or for crop irrigation. And really quickly, that resulted in reduced production from animals. So about 30% of respondents said they experienced lower milk production. They saw reduced live animal weights. The honey producers said that there was less honey production happening as a result of the dry weather. Those production losses then translated into financial implications for businesses. So when we saw lower yields, we saw declined revenue, we saw higher labor costs, we saw increased water resource investments. Operations that had never had to irrigate before were needing to find irrigation resources and sources. Operations that had never had a well go dry were purchasing water for 2.5 months and providing portalets for their employees and visitors to their place of business. The average estimated financial loss was about $78,000. 70% of survey respondents considered the financial health of their business vulnerable to another climate event. And about half of respondents, which we'll show in just a second, anticipated needing financial assistance to recover from the drought. So what we heard was that businesses plan to invest in water infrastructure. So again, for either crop irrigation or livestock watering. Many operations were looking at making changes in the scale of crop production or herd sizes. So again, maybe fewer animals with lower feed needs. Others were looking at changing the crops that they may produce, so more drought tolerant species. Significant interest in implementing conservation practices that focused on soil health improvements. A few businesses, so I think about 10% considered either relocating their business, adding additional acreage, seeking a new farm, or possibly seeking business closure as a solution in response to the drought for them. We have a slide later on to talk about crop insurance, just because that's something that this group has chatted about. Only 8% of respondents enrolled in crop insurance as a response to the drought. So in addition to businesses acknowledging that they needed financial support as a result of the drought recovery, an additional 29% were looking at water resource assistance. Based on the conversations we had and the testimonial from producers, the real emotional and mental health support and strain and uncertainty of the stress of this time or of the consecutive weather impacts was of real note. One of the follow-ups to the survey was we shared the specific survey response data with about 6 technical service provider partners who now have the survey responses, and it's not anonymized for them if they had chosen or choose in the future to do some sort of technical assistance follow-up and support. Last piece I'll say on this slide, we also asked questions for businesses about the long-term concerns that were sort of outside their control. So thinking about landscape implications and market factors. So businesses, noted that like winter kill of crops going into this growing season, if we had a lack of nutrient stores or increased disease and pest pressure could cause an impact on future crop yields. There was concerns that because they had insufficient pasture of what overgrazing land would do in response and recovery in the 2026 season. A concern of whether surface waters recharged would happen in time and sufficiently for them to use the existing resources that they've had. Many farmers took out additional loans and debt that they incurred in 2025 and some cases from 23 and 24, and a concern of their ability, especially with increased production costs and low milk prices, their ability to pay off that debt. And then as we talked about, just like that overall vulnerability to another season of extreme weather events and the persistent drought conditions that we're experiencing still. This is the crop insurance trend slide, just to kind of make a quick reference to this. So majority of survey respondents don't have crop insurance. It's mostly large farms that do have crop insurance. So you can see about 90% of those farms that do have insurance are in the large farm category, but far smaller percentage in the small and medium-sized farm. Mostly dairy operations, not our livestock produce or diversified operations, carry proper livestock insurance. And then this is the last slide. I don't need to read this to you, but this includes some of the specific farmer and business quotes about the impacts on their businesses. And I just note it was continuously disheartening to read and understand kind of the losses that these businesses experienced, the increased toll on their families and labor force to be able to haul water or plant product and plants that then died, and just like that real concern for future viability of the landscape. All right, so that's what we have to share. You can again find all the information if you're interested from the report that was published in March and the data dashboard that exists on the agency's website under our drought resources.
Hey, Abby, can I ask you a quick question? Back a couple slides ago, you said the average loss was 78,000 per farm. Was that solely related to the drought or 78,000 over the 3 years of impact?
No, just their
Just the
estimated claims for losses related to the drought.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
Yeah.
That's pretty massive.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think the timing of the survey is informative in that, particularly in, like, say, the maple sector, they didn't know what their actual production levels would be because the season just ended just a few weeks ago. And so they made estimations based upon what their incurred costs were, which were pretty accurate, of like the water hauling or increased labor, or if they had a retail operation and needed to put out portalets, like those were real costs. Their estimated projected losses during the season were truly that. They were estimations based upon kind of the stress that they saw in the trees or what they anticipated they might not see in sap yields and therefore syrup production in the following season. So I just give maple as an example of, like, yes, they made claims that were estimates. And I think all those worries about future insufficient pasture or even the cost of purchased feed were, again, all estimates. A lot of producers had not actually been able to locate and find the sufficient quality feed that they needed to make it through the full winter when they completed the survey. So they did their best, and most of our surveys have been in that same ilk of kind of capturing what businesses anticipate their losses would be without knowing the true costs. So yeah, I think weather remains this ongoing concern and shift in our landscape. I don't think any of us can anticipate what this growing season will bring. It's been sort of slow onset of spring, not a lot of rain, certainly not too much rain, also not too much heat. So I think we're still early, still May. We haven't kind of made it into the full season spread to know how the growing season will fare. But I think we're pretty acutely aware of the vulnerability of the industry and just the increased stress that they feel of not knowing whether this year will be a successful season, market-wise or weather-wise. And that level of uncertainty is difficult for us to support and respond to. The S60 bill, I'll just mention. So S60 created the program for farm and forestry natural disaster relief and assistance program at the Agency of Agriculture. So that passed this session and will come into effect on July 1st, which would allow a review board to be stood up and for resources to be distributed to businesses that experience natural disaster related losses. There currently is not an appropriation in the budget to support the mechanism that currently exists and will be effective as of July 1. So just as a heads up on the 2025 and going forward. And then I think Nicole can talk about the 220 block grant funds, which are federal resources targeting the 23 and 24 seasons.
Hey, Abby, real quick.
Yeah.
My mind is spinning just because of, the work NRCS does. We could do a lot for irrigation in the state, soil health, water conserving crop rotations, things like that. I'm curious, and maybe this is a question for UVM and extension team, or maybe the Agency of Ag. What is there any research out there or predictions or for irrigation need? I think one of the things that I really struggle with is most folks that come to us for irrigation want to punch a well. And sometimes it could be costly, sometimes they don't have any water, and it's a little bit challenging from that perspective. And what does that do, right? If everybody starts punching a well, I don't know, are there adverse impacts to the resources there? Just curious about research. And then any research on water conserving or drought tolerant crops that some of the folks had responded to. I just have lots of questions in my mind just thinking about how NRCS could potentially respond and leverage some resources there. You don't need to answer that.
I don't know,
yeah.
But I think it's a great I think that the desire by so many businesses to look at both irrigation resources and soil health improvements does make me think that this is an opportunity. And I suspect that we could see an increase in NRCS applications for those types of practices. I think you're asking of is there a groundwater table, impact if we put in, 50 new wells or in similar aquifers. I have no idea, but I think that could be an interesting research project. And I know that there has been some drought tolerant kind of species research done. And probably would be great to kind of pull that up and see how relevant that is or how recent it is to Vermont. I like both of those follow-ups, Travis.
All right. Any additional reflections or questions for Abby?
Is our crop insurance uptake unusually low, or is it kind of par for the course at the scale of farms that we generally have?
My understanding is that it's par for the course for the size of farms that we generally have. Over the last 3 years, it has been told to me from multiple different angles that the crop insurance programs in general, both the federal programs and private crop insurance, are primarily geared towards benefiting kind of large scale commodity crops. But, Abby or Laura, if you have something to chime in, or anybody. If you have other information, chime in.
I don't. I mean, I know the Welch team has worked on this. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on crop insurance.
Daryl, do you
relevant to
want to
Vermont.
speak to that? Or
Everybody put Daryl on the spot.
I liked your answer. Your answer was
yeah,
good
no,
for
and I
my
can
level
also
of
add, I mean,
understanding.
again,
Yeah.
I'm still getting my feet, but the one thing that I am familiar with is that we have the Weather Act, which is like a indexed based crop insurance. So it would be something that would work better for Vermont farmers, basically whenever a certain index, so like a certain amount of flooding or a certain amount of drought, but also wind, freeze, any kind of severe weather impacts, it automatically would trigger insurance payouts. So that's a program that we've been pushing for. And I think I'm pretty sure Daryl would definitely know better, but the House bill includes something like that specifically for freeze events at the behest of folks in Florida on citrus
Mhm.
crops. But I
Yeah.
think, it's definitely something that we would like to see. So yeah, there are
But it's
ideas
like-
out there anyway.
Yeah, Miles, you
So that's
got
more
it.
like parametric? Or
Yeah, it's parametric.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
And there's improvements to whole farm as well that we've been pushing for, and micro farm, but those haven't gotten much traction, at least this Congress. But I'm not sure we're going to see a farm bill this year either. So I don't. I think there's going to be another crack at improving those crop insurance programs, but yeah, I think Miles covered at least what we've been pushing for pretty well.
Thanks for the indulgence.
All right, I'm going to do kind of a brief update on the 220 block grant status, and then I'll open it up for anyone who wants to provide updates from their organization. So here's my rapid fire explanation of what this is again. 220 block grant, right? It was allocated in December of 2024 in the continuing resolution. It appropriated $220 million to the 6 New England states plus Hawaii and Alaska. Tentatively, Vermont has been awarded $31.75 million for disaster recovery, specifically for 2023 and 2024 weather events. This funding should cover infrastructure, future revenue loss, market loss, timber, and bare ground practices. We have been negotiating back and forth with USDA, specifically the Farm Service Agency, since April of 2025. At this point, we have a drafted statement of work and a drafted work plan that have gone through all of our point people at FSA and is now sitting with OGC. So that is good. That is supposed to be a final step in this towards execution. Whether OGC will have edits for us or not, I'm not sure, but I will say that they have so far gone through it with a fine-tooth comb, so I would hope that there is not a lot of extra edits for us. Right now, I'm really hopeful that we won't have to change our schedule again, knock on wood, but we are planning to be prepared to have applications live on this program, on the first phase of this program in fall of 2026. We have also brought on a contractor. It is Tetra Tech, and we have a master contract with them through Vermont Emergency Management, and they are doing a statement of work specifically for the Agency of Agriculture around this project, mostly helping us create materials, an eligibility structure, and then also kind of outreach planning. We still have some other steps involved, like we need to go to our joint fiscal office, be able to formally accept the grant, and also request a couple, 3 limited service positions, because this will be a 5-year project. There'll be 2 phases. So all in all, it is moving along. And this is probably the last couple months or so have been the quickest progress that that have come on in this. So I'm being very hopeful. Yeah. Other than that, I think that's all from me. I'll open the floor to whoever else has updates or questions. No takers? Okay. All right, well, it is 11:52, so if no other comments or questions, we can close 8 minutes early, and we will see you for a drop-in session in a couple weeks.
I just ask, can we get a Farm Bill update? I think Daryl gave us the
Oh.
doom and gloom, but tell us more if
You got any
if you
sunshine
would.
and rainbows, Daryl?
More about what not happening?
Yeah, so if you're aware, the Farm Bill passed the House. So it's over in this, I mean, we have to do something in the Senate now. We haven't heard anything from the committee on if it's going to be marked up or not. I think the main sticking point, I think there are a couple, but I think the major one that has been the red line for Democrats has been addressing the SNAP cuts and the cost shift, which the Republican side has been unwilling to even open a conversation on. And so I think at the moment, without any conversation or agreement on, at minimum, giving states at least 2 years to a 2-year exemption on the cost shift to states, I don't think there are going to be enough Democrat votes in the Senate for it to pass. And I think that might also impact if it even comes up in committee for a markup. But to be seen. I try not to make any major pronouncements anymore because I've been proven wrong, I think, this entire Congress.
That was not
It
quite
all seems so
sunshine and
obvious.
rainbows,
I
but
was about to say, was that sufficiently doom and gloom for you?
Yeah.
It's good to know. I like the realistic perspective.
I just work here.
Same.
Eric, you always have the commentary that lightens the mood, though. I appreciate that.
The fool
Um,
always
Travis,
dies
what
in the
about
end.
federal kind of conservation program funding, or what do you have to share there?
Are you asking me or yeah?
Oh, no, I guess that's
Um,
asking you.
Yeah, so we're actually doing really well, to be honest. I mean, staffing wise, we're still down, but I think this year, combined EQIP, CSP, easement programs, it's the highest we've ever been. We just have significant progress. I think the entire partnership is really stepping in to leveraging kind of the outreach and bringing producers in. And so I think this year we'll spend probably almost $20 million in EQIP, $5 million in CSP. And remember, when I started, we were spending like $160,000 in CSP a year. And then I don't even remember, what was the name of the group that, Marley, help me out. It was like the Soil Health team was like, hey, let's focus on CSP, and the Agency of Ag came up with the CSP Assist program, and going from spending $160,000 a year to producers to now this year we're on target to do $5 million. Just we're honestly feeling pretty good about the opportunities. We think next year is going to be a big year for us too. So, yeah.
Wait, that was positivity.
I say that
What the
was more
heck?
sunshine.
Better quit while we're ahead
It's
today.
very possible. Happiness
Um,
is the best revenge.
All right. Any other rapid fire updates in our last 4 minutes? Otherwise, we can adjourn.
Thank you for planning these overviews, Nicole. This was great. Thanks, Laura and Abby. Really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah. The thanks goes to Abby and Laura. They do great and put together things, especially the visuals that actually make it sink into my brain. So I hope it helped you all.
Yeah, super helpful. I think there's work that NRCS and I think the partnerships can do to, provide some resources to producers for sure. We just want to make sure we're doing it the right way. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would love to see like an ongoing conversation. I think this was helpful, and it was time consuming to kind of lay the land on kind of like the maybe near crisis for dairy industry and challenges impacted by, challenges as a result of natural disaster impacts, and maybe spend time at a drop-in session or another in-person session thinking about what collaborative strategies we want to use to help respond and support businesses into this growing season and into the future. I think it's easy to follow up with Vern and Heather and ask about drought tolerant species and research, and that I'm happy to do. But I also think the task force could be a space where those larger scale conversations happen, and maybe that's what we can hold space for next time.
Yeah, I'd be interested. It would be helpful for us as we design our 27 programs, right? Fiscal year 27 programs. We do, the agency does give state conservationists some autonomy when we design our programs, and just want to make sure that, we're investing in the right space. So it'd be helpful for us selfishly.
Great.
Right. Thank you all.
Good to
Have
see
a good
everybody.
day.
Thanks
Yeah.
for
Take
keeping
care.
it
Bye.
together, Nicole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.